Hello, it is January 13th, 2025. I'm Kathleen Newman. Thanks for joining Maine Historical Society for another virtual program. This program is called Food of the Future with our guest speaker, Adam Shprintzen. Now, let's just take a moment to remember that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homeland, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we're on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. This evening's talk, Food of the Future, is a talk that's offered as a companion to MHS's exhibit, Maine's Untold Vegetarian History. And that exhibit is on view at MHS through May 17th, 2025. And you can also see it online. If you visit our website, mainehistory.org, you can check out our online exhibits. And of course, that's also where you can sign up to become an MHS member, visit our exhibits for free, and where you can sign up for Maine Connections so that you can stay in the know on talks like this and everything that's happening at MHS. So joining us this evening is Adam Shprintzen. He is an assistant professor of history at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He is the author of The Vegetarian Crusade, The Rise of an American Reform Movement, 1817 to 1921. And tonight he's joining us to talk about vegetarianism, how it's been practiced in the US since the country's founding. But a lot of us have a misunderstanding of the early years of that movement. So he's going to shed some light on that history for us this evening. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Kathleen, thank you so much for having me, and greetings everybody from beautiful Scranton, Pennsylvania. Thank you all for taking the time tonight to listen to me talk about vegetarian history for a little bit. I am going to share my screen and my slides here. First off, just my sincere thanks to Kathleen and to everybody at Maine Historical for giving me this chance to talk to you all tonight. This one feels kind of extra special for me. My first job in history was actually at a historical society, a very small historical society in New York when I was an undergrad. So I've always really valued the work of that historical societies do. And now as a historian, I also rely upon historical societies for not just the materials that they make available, both in person and digitally, but also as stewards of public history and being able to communicate the importance of history to the public at large. So this is my plug to say renew your memberships or get a membership or be involved in your local historical societies. They are incredibly important places. Very quick note before I get into this. What we're going to focus on tonight is the vegetarian movement. So this isn't going to be focusing in on everybody who abstained from meat during the time period that we're covering. A lot of people would have abstained from meat out of pure necessity. And for any other number of reasons, economic necessity. And they're not really part of my story because we're looking at the kind of coalescing of these people around an idea of meat abstention as a political and social movement to form kind of a unified community. And that's where our focus is going to be. So I always kind of pause to think about the fact that there's a whole ton of people that were vegetarian in diet, as we would recognize it today, who are not part of my story, but they are there. Okay, but there are a lot of people that are part of my story, and I want to start here. I want to start with a couple of different descriptions of vegetarians and vegetarianism that are separated by about 50 some odd years. The first one that you see here is from the fall of 1860, when a Brooklyn, New York woman under the pseudonym of Julia Beefeater wrote into Vanity Fair magazine complaining about the perils of her existence and the challenges that were facing her life. Now, rather than focusing on the sectional crisis that threatened the Union or the continued evils of the chattel slave system, the author of this letter launched a rant against a dietary civil war that was taking place in her very own household. She explained that she was tormented by inflictions heaped on my plate 3 times a day by my cabbage-headed husband. And as a result, she had written to the magazine for advice on how to best deal with her husband's dietary choices. She explained that he had traveled to that wretched Philadelphia on what he claimed was a business trip, but she had found out the truth. Instead, he had visited in order to attend the 11th anniversary of the American Vegetarian Society, where he would suffer the fate of having his head crammed with nonsensical ideas about beans, potatoes, and cold water. The letter concluded with the warning of a vegetarian diet's effect on the couple's marriage, and the premonition of Beefeater's own potential secession from the union of marriage itself, explaining, "I will sue for a divorce from this garden bed and vegetable life." She claimed to be so physically weak that she had to sit down to even write her letter. And the cause was her husband's odious vegetarian diet that was more fit for an old cow instead of the graceful but half-starved. All right, a second description written less than 50 years later in 1902 was quite different. A newspaper article reported on the exploits of Gilman Lowe, who you see here, who was a New York-based vegetarian bodybuilder described as being a model of physical perfection. The article advocated for the muscle-building properties of vegetarianism, reporting that Lowe established a record for the most weight lifted in a short period of time, hoisting an incredible 1.6 million pounds over a 35-minute period. The article celebrated Lowe's accomplishment, explaining that an event took place which should silence every carping critic of vegetarianism, and that Lowe's incredible exhibition of strength was proof of the superiority of a vegetarian diet from the standpoint of endurance and strength. And when I first started to look into vegetarian history, my initial research focused on kind of reading through the press coverage during the entirety of the 19th century and a little bit beyond. And very quickly, I noticed these really stark differences in presentations of vegetarians. Vegetarians as weak, sort of emaciated cowards in the early half of the century. And then by the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, they were athletic, they were bodybuilders attached to the physical culture movement of the time period. So I was really curious how this change in perceptions happened, and then also thinking about why these perceptions existed in each of their time periods. I want to give one last description here, but this one's on the role of a vegetarian diet because it maybe helps explain the transition that we're going to see as we chart out vegetarianism over time in the 19th century in America. This one is provided by Russell Trull, you see here, a medical doctor and hydrotherapist, that he gave at a speech at the 10th anniversary meeting of the American Vegetarian Society in 1860. And Trull's description gives us a good sense of the centrality of diet to these reformers, which is why I find them to be so interesting. But this section also maybe gives us a sense of why vegetarians were so feared and derided during the antebellum period. In a sprawling speech about the continued importance of vegetarianism as a total social reform movement, Trull noted the larger political and social state of the United States, but he placed diet as the cure for all these ills. Now, this might sound kind of strange, especially in the face of the challenges of the time period and the continuation and expansion of the slave system, but vegetarians were the first group to think in a sort of coordinated way of the social and political implications of food choice in America, and I think that's a really important thing. And so this movement that starts in the early 19th century coalesces by the middle of the century in our moment of greatest potential for change and reform, and then kind of unravels and reemerges different by the end of the century, is key to not just understanding food and its potential as a reform movement, but I'd argue to actually understanding the United States at large during this wild, chaotic, and foundational time period in our history. And amazingly, it starts really modestly with 41 people who traveled across the Atlantic in the March of 1817. In that spring, a group of dissident Christians from the Bible Christian Church immigrated to Philadelphia from Liverpool, England. As a political center and one where various reform movements were popping up at the time, Philadelphia seemed like the perfect location for a reform-minded radical movement. And their ideology certainly was controversial for a variety of reasons. The Bible Christians believed that religion was only understandable through scientific study, and that in order to understand Revelation, it was a constantly evolving process based on scientific observations of the time. And of course, for our purposes, was their abstention from meat. The group argued that a fleshless diet produced clear and moral thought, that it diminished violent tendencies and cruel choices such as slaveholding or capital punishment. Now, as you can imagine, Bible Christians were met with some resistance. One Philadelphia church warned of what they called wolves in sheep's clothing. And I also came across numerous accounts of Bible Christians just on the street being met with accusations of heresy and other forms of harassment. Despite these protests, the group became an established force in Philadelphia's religious and reform scenes, building a church on the city's north side in 1821. You saw the first image of the first church and how it grew over time. By 1830, the church was formally incorporated by the Pennsylvania state legislature and became more popular outside of its own community, spreading its message through the printed word. At the same time, the group gained the attention of a frequently physically ill, though marvelous public speaker by the name of Sylvester Graham. Okay, now I know, especially speaking with a Maine-centric audience, that we have some strong connections between Portland and Graham, and we'll get to those in a second. But I want to provide some context around Graham and Grahamism first. Sylvester Graham first came to prominence during a mass cholera epidemic in urban America. The simultaneous growth of American cities, along with these new waves of immigrants that entered urban areas, contributed to overcrowding. A lack of available municipal services ensured that impoverished urban areas remained dirty and disease-ridden and overcrowded. By June of 1832, cholera appeared in North America, first in Quebec, and quickly spread to the United States before the month was over. In just 2 months, nearly 3,500 New Yorkers, primarily the working class inhabitants of the crowded slums, died from the epidemic. Mercury chloride was given out to those affected to serve as a strong purgative to induce purification, like literally trying to vomit out the illness. While laudanum, which is a strong opiate that included opium and morphine, was administered in a glass of hot brandy to help treat intense stomach pains. On a federal level, all that could be offered by Congress was a call for a national day of fasting and prayer, spurred on by Senator Henry Clay's hope for a providential cure. As these treatments and prayers proved to be ineffective and Americans struggled to figure out the reasons for the epidemic, Sylvester Graham offered strikingly different advice on how to best treat and avoid the deadly disease. Graham argued that a combination of factors contributed to the cholera epidemic. He placed diet and overstimulation, though, at the center of his explanation for this great scourge. Americans, Graham preached, were detached and ignorant of the natural laws that regulated the human body and drunk off of a diet heavy in stimulants. Animal flesh, he argued, was essentially rotting and inorganic, that it led to impure blood and the draining of vital power in order to digest such unnatural substances. Graham was clear in laying the blame squarely on meat eating and alcohol consumption for the cholera epidemic, pointing towards what he called dietetic intemperance and lewdness as the cause of the spread of the disease. During the same time, Graham began preaching a gospel of physical and mental restraint, particularly emphasizing the evils of drink, masturbation, and flesh foods, all things that he believed caused overstimulation. In response, Graham started talking about the benefits of using his Graham bread, unbolted wheat bread that was free of things like chlorine that was used to bleach bread to make it white during the time period. As you might imagine, Graham's preaching caused some very public denouncements of his movement. The thing is, even if many actually agreed with the sort of anti-sexual nature of his diatribes, it remained really controversial that he made these speeches precisely because they were in the public's eye, and even more so because they included audiences where he spoke to men, and then even more controversially, audiences where he was speaking specifically to women. Here, I just want to give a shout out to a great book, April Hayes, who you see here, Riotous Flesh, which talks a lot about Graham's anti-masturbation crusade and also thinking about the ways in which gender played into people's responses to that. The anti-Graham riots in Portland at the Temple Street Chapel, you see sort of a description here of how people viewed Graham during the time period and the anger and the intense anger that he brought up based on his speeches, but also based on the perception that he was kind of a quack, a faddist, and things like that. Still, even with these pretty violent responses, Graham's followers turned into a distinct movement known as Grahamites, individuals who abstained from meat as a means to create both physical and moral health. And Grahamites frequently attested to the diet's positive effects using the style of evangelical religious conversion popular at the time in order to describe these changes, or what I like to refer to as vegetarian conversion narratives. Asenath Nicholson, who you see here, was a social reformer and writer who eventually traveled to Ireland to document the potato famine, explained that until age 16, she consumed tea, coffee, alcohol, and meat, all of which made her nerves so completely unstrung that the sight of a book put me in a universal tremor. But after attending a Graham lecture, she was overcome by a spiritual rapture, writing that she had heard and trembled. The torrent of truth poured upon me and made me a thorough convert. Nicholson was so inspired by Graham that she opened a boarding house in New York City based on its principles, the first of many such establishments that would pop up in urban America. Grahamites advanced the notion that meat abstention was connected to a whole reform lifestyle, or as one Grahamite explained, the boarders in this establishment are not only reformers in diet, but radicalists in politics. Such a knot of abolitionists I never before fell in with. These boarding houses, interestingly enough, were also part of sort of larger geographies of reform and reformers. They're often located around other reform movement headquarters and establishments, such as anti-slavery societies, women's rights organizations, and temperance organizations. Meat abstention became a central part of Grahamism and was presented as a total cure. Now, it's important to note that Graham's advice and followers' actions often were more healthy than many Americans at the time who had diets that were really heavy in meat, lots of alcohol consumption and tobacco imbibing. But instead, Grahamites emphasized not just flesh-free eating, but also constant bathing, exercise, fresh air, and temperance from alcohol. So in some ways, the results that came out of this provided evidence for these conversion narratives, even if the reasons may not have been so cut and dry. Right? For example, Grahamites probably did better during the cholera epidemic because they were avoiding purgatives, and not necessarily because of their diet per se, or because they were bathing more frequently. But it was kind of evidence that things were working. Perhaps most importantly, though, these early vegetarians tied the diet together with social reform, including abolitionism, women's rights, economic equality, and pacifism. This maybe also explains the nature of these conversion narratives, right? To try to convince people who are maybe on the fence about the dietary benefits, but who are on board with the social reform message. Lavinia Wright, for example, an abolitionist and advocate for women's rights, explained that her dietary change led to the end of physical and mental lethargy that was caused by the injustice and cruelty of destroying animal existence and the injurious effects produced by the undue stimulation resulting from the use of animal food. Abolitionist William Goodell claimed that he was cured from nervous irritability and that a total abstinence from all artificial stimuli, the general adoption of a vegetable diet, would tend in a remarkable degree to ameliorate the condition of mankind, both physical and moral. Food was connected not just to moral uplift, but also a larger social improvement for society at large. Now, if we're going to talk about these sort of public pronouncements that people were making about why they decided to become Grahamites, we have to kind of understand the ways that meat abstainers were being presented in the popular press and medical literature at the time. The medical establishment wielded a number of attacks at Graham's dietary advice, ranging from mere faddism to dietary extremism, to causes of insanity, like you see here. They presented sort of well-familiar claims that a lack of meat would make for weak, tired, and even effeminate individuals, particularly in men. It's interesting to note that medical journals were contested territory, though, as supporters of Grahamism used the same pages to defend the diet, often promoting their arguments through the established medical knowledge of the time. And Graham himself, even though he's promoted often even as a quack today, read and interacted with the same scientific literature and medical literature used by trained medical practitioners at the time. So I think the idea of framing him through the lens of faddism or quackism doesn't quite hold up to the historical record. All right, a brief sort of side note on this is that we see a very similar thing pop up from time to time in the popular press, and I'm always fascinated when this happens, when all of a sudden somebody makes the connection between Graham and graham crackers. Graham did not invent the graham cracker in any way that we know it. They were first invented by the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco, at the end of the 19th century. It is interesting that Nabisco put his name on that product, but he was very well dead and long dead at that point, and the product looked nothing like the graham bread that he invented. But what I think is interesting as these things pop up, and these are actually just the three that you're seeing here in the New York Post, the Daily Mail, and Vice popped up in the last few weeks, is that they actually kind of present Graham in very similar ways that he was at the time, by seeing him as kind of a quack, just kind of emphasizing the sort of strangeness of his diet and of his ideals. By 1840, though, Graham had actually gone into semi-retirement. And while his movement remained, other groups also began flirtations with meatless dietetics. In 1850, these other groups joined together to create the first national vegetarian organization in the United States, the American Vegetarian Society, or the AVS, which was founded in 1850 and continued its operations for 12 years until 1862. The group was the first large-scale attempt in the United States at organizing around the idea of abstaining from meat. And the AVS actually helped popularize and define the very term vegetarianism in America. At the group's first anniversary meeting, vegetarianism was defined as, quote, the art and science which teaches to modify for food those products of the vegetable kingdom which are best adapted to produce and sustain a sound mind and a sound body. Interestingly, the group allowed for the use of eggs and dairy products, though not without some controversy and debate, and pretty harsh debate amongst members. The idea with this is that it resulted from the fact that the AVS preached that products that cause pain, suffering, bloodshed, and death were to be avoided, whereas they saw eggs and dairy not necessarily doing that. Grahamism and early vegetarianism, which included both what we would call vegans and vegetarians, faced these really harsh attacks from the popular press at the time. They were presented as frail, weak, fattest, quacks, often sickly. We certainly have seen these themes echo over time and place in the United States. Men were usually illustrated as sexually impotent, while women were presented as shrill, overbearing, and unpleasant. The vegetarian movement had the unfortunate luck of popping up at the same time as a penny press in urban America known as the flash press that celebrated hypermasculinity, violent spectacles in sports such as bare-knuckle boxing and cockfighting. And the newspapers also sort of highlighted drinking and dining culture in America. As you might imagine, meat abstainers became a target. One flash article, for example, described vegetarians as weakly and degenerated, while another said vegetarians were infantine and humbugs and were obsessed with potatoes, beans, and broccoli, and as a result could not attain to a very high degree of intellectual culture. Vegetarians were also often shown to look like vegetables themselves or animals grazing, in essence, equating vegetarianism with a denial of their basic humanity as individuals. The attacks, however, also revealed a lot about the fears of meat abstention as a reform movement and the other movements that they advocated for, and how they saw vegetarianism as the catalyst for all these movements. I'm reminded here that one reformer referred to vegetarianism as a quote unquote Archimedean lever by which all other reform would result. Now, these are utopian goals to be sure, right? That a dietary change can lead to a change to all these other great social issues. But how is it believed this would actually work in practice? Vegetarian pacifists, for example, focus squarely on the effects of the collective actions of humanity. Social ills, they said, were only possible through intemperate diets that aroused angry, violent urges that then people acted out on. As a result, a collective turn towards vegetarianism, even more than a shift in political systems, held the power to change society's acceptance of bloodshed to other fellow humans. Vegetarians viewed communal dietary choices as having more transformative power than even the collective policies of a federal government. The image that you see here to me was one of the amazing just light bulb moments that I had when I started researching this. This is a Courier and Ives print from 1855 that's discussing the 1856 presidential election. Located all the way to the right, facing the screen, is John C. Fremont, the 1856 presidential candidate, the first presidential candidate for the Republican Party. And in this lineup are different reformers advocating to Fremont for their particular cause. So going in order right to left, we have a free person of color. We have a Catholic priest. There was a whisper campaign that Fremont was a closeted Catholic. After that, there's a free love advocate, somebody who believed who did not believe in monogamy, even in marriage. And there's a really great pun in this one where she says that we are all free mounters. Love the 19th century. Following her, there's a utopian socialist, and then a women's rights advocate, and then all the way to the left, in that same sort of weak, frail state, we see the vegetarian advocating for a law to ban alcohol, tobacco, and meat consumption. Now, while vegetarians never called for a law to ban meat consumption, the fact that this person was put here amongst these other really visible and really prominent and important reform movements of that time period shows just how well known the movement was as we start pushing towards the Civil War years. Still, these attacks that I was just talking about that vegetarians face are kind of important to keep in mind because I think they help inform a new vegetarianism in the United States that crops up by the 1870s. The American Vegetarian Society folded by 1864. Obviously, a big reason is because there's bigger things going on in the country at the time. And many of its members became far more focused on the issue of abolitionism, even taking up arms in the Civil War to try to fight to end the slave system. But there's a massive change for vegetarians and vegetarianism in the post-Civil War years to come. And the catalyst for this shift is another couple of kind of semi-familiar figures, John Harvey Kellogg and then Ella Eaton Kellogg. There's some main connections here to this story because Ellen White, who is the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventists that the Kellogg's followed, was from southern Maine originally. The Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan that Kellogg directed began a process that shifted popular images of vegetarians away from the ones that existed of weakness in the early 19th century. And interestingly, a lot of this change was created by culinary inventions. The Sanitarium, or the San as it was popularly known, was a wildly popular health resort that aimed to cure any number of chronic illnesses ranging from stomach ailments all the way through to physical injuries and even cancer. Just as importantly, the San was also a popular vacation spot. A new generation of vegetarians at the end of the 19th century venerated the benefits of so-called meat substitutes, products that were first produced at the San. Vegetarian products that were purported to have even higher nutritional value than meat, but exhibited similar taste, consistency, and qualities as flesh foods. Thanks to mail order, it was possible for customers to have in their homes the same products that were used at the famed Battle Creek Sanitarium. Vegetarians were also promised a variety of products that looked, smelled, and even tasted like meat. To help facilitate these vegetarian products and vegetarian living, Ella Eaton Kellogg established an experimental kitchen at the San to produce appetizing and nutritious vegetarian products. After all, think about this, visitors to the San were utilizing valuable vacation time in order to take time to spend in Battle Creek. The daily menu needed to appeal to both the mind and the palate to ensure that guests would continue flocking into Battle Creek. You can see just how extravagant sort of the dining room itself looked like, and the meals needed to match this level of sort of sophistication. The experimental kitchen at the Battle Creek Sanitarium opened its doors for the first time during the summer of 1883. The kitchen was built with important goals in mind. Eden Kellogg explained that the food laboratory was being built for the purposes of conducting a series of experiments during several months, with a view to improve the methods of cookery in relation to health. Eden Kellogg's role was to lead the experimental kitchen, particularly the practical work, because of her ability to do significant literary labor, reading up about the topics. Work in the kitchen helped change and revolutionize not both vegetarian foods in the United States, food products in general, but also for our purposes, perceptions of vegetarianism and vegetarians in culture and society at large. And you get one more view of the experimental kitchen. There are beakers and scientific equipment. The idea is to bring sort of rationality to the process of understanding the health properties and qualities of food. Soon after the kitchen was opened in early 1896, J.H. Kellogg began a correspondence with Charles W. Dabney, who was an agricultural scientist and the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Agriculture at the time. Dabney was impressed by Kellogg's reputation and sought assistance in developing what he described as a scientifically prepared plant product, affording all the essential nutrient qualities of beef or mutton. He feared the consequences of the growing price of meat and the potential for disease to cause a meat shortage. Keep in mind that this is a decade before the passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act, so there's a lack of federal regulation. The state of food production in the United States was remarkably dangerous and unmonitored. Kellogg himself was also keenly interested in creating a meat alternative to be able to serve to guests at the SAM, but then also to expand his empire into grocers and mail catalogs. A total of 9 meat substitutes were invented and immediately prepared for the SAM's guests. Eventually, these became available via mail order, and you can see the first mail catalog here. And then, like I said, also in fresh grocers, not just around the United States, but eventually shipped around the globe. The Sanitas Nut Company that you see named here would eventually become the Battle Creek Food Company, also showing how the name Battle Creek started to get some cachet itself as well. The first products that were explicitly marketed as meat substitutes were nut butters. The SAN actually helped popularize their use in the United States. Nut butters were sold in a variety of forms: almond butter, peanut butter, things like that. Advertisements that sold the Sans nut butter via mail order emphasized that it was free from the disease, germs, and bacteria of dairy butter, trying to ensure that people felt quality around these products. It was not only safer than its dairy-based cousin, it was more versatile, appealing to all audiences, and a perfect food that was popular for receptions, picnics, and luncheons. Kellogg's marketing efforts promoting nuts as a meat alternative made headway among both vegetarians and non-vegetarians alike during the time period. The edible portion of a nut during that time period started to be called and referred to in popular jargon as the meat. The advertisements around the Sans nuts and nut butters often also emphasize the idea of the blood-making properties of eating nuts, which is essentially protein, which you'll certainly see nut butters marketed towards as well today. Meat substitutes developed in the experimental kitchen not only changed culinary choice for vegetarians, but also kind of shifted the goals of the movement. Nut toast was the first meat substitute produced in the kitchen, though it would not become the most well-known. Nut toast was a mix of ground nuts that was bound together by cereal grains. It was, as explained by Ella Eaton, intended as a substitute for meat, having nearly twice the nutritive value, while it furnishes the same elements and in a form wholly free from the objectionable features of meat. But the product that hastened on a massive change and revolution for vegetarian food in the United States and the movement itself was Protos, the most well-known and celebrated Battle Creek meat analog. The product itself explains how the Battle Creek experimental kitchen shifted the vegetarian movement's ideals through food. Earlier generations of vegetarians ranted against all qualities of meat and the mental and physical problems that it reportedly caused. Protos, however, was promoted as copying the basic qualities of meat. It was a combination of wheat gluten, cereal, and peanut butter sold in 12-ounce or 1 pound tin cans and marketed specifically to consumers as being quote unquote vegetable meat. By 1914, Protos was widely available and consumed throughout the United States, with shipments of more than 144,000 pounds of Protos being shipped across the United States, doubling its amount from the turn of the 20th century. Advertisements stressed the principles of modern scientific cookery, as Protos was described as being one of the latest and greatest triumphs of modern discovery, so closely resembling meat in appearance, flavor, and texture as almost to deceive an epicure. The vegetable meat so closely resembled meat in all ways that chefs and foodies alike reported having difficulties believing that Protos was not, in fact, real meat. We see the growth of this brand also emphasizing the idea of trust through celebrity endorsement. Clara Barton giving this endorsement for the Sanitas products and thinking about the idea of building a national brand and trustworthiness of that through a celebrity endorsement like Barton. Protos was purported to look, feel, and smell like meat, and it had the added benefit of being cheaper than canned meats. A 1 pound can of Protos sold for 30 cents in 1912, whereas a 1 pound can of canned meat that same year sold for 35 cents, showing a fairly significant cost savings for those looking to make the transition to the vegetable meat. One more Protos ad, again, also showing and emphasizing sort of the meaty qualities of it, but also emphasizing its versatility, the different ways that it can be used, the different ways that it can be prepared. Okay, and speaking of the ways that it can be prepared, here was my very first attempt at making Protos many moons ago. This is a vague recipe that I kind of came up with based on some descriptions of it in old cookbooks, cookery guides. It's very non-precise. This is it in its raw form, so this is what it would have looked like as it came out of the tin cans. And at that point, you could then transform it, bake it, roast it, so on and so forth. I did actually make it in other forms at certain times, and it photographs a lot better when you cook it. The product became so well known and meat substitutes themselves became so prominent that they gained the attention of the most famous and prominent cookbook author of the time period, Sarah Tyson Rohrer, who was a culinary teacher and cookbook writer based out of Philadelphia. At the turn of the 20th century, she wrote this whole cookbook that focused specifically on using vegetables as a meat substitute. And the majority of the cookbook focuses on meat substitutes and the products coming out of the sand and similar products that you can make at home. And then I just have one menu here where you see Protos pop up in this restaurant meal that shows sort of the cachet that it's getting, right? That it's being used to entertain people in political clubs, but also emphasizing the idea that it's being found sort of in the upper echelons of political and social and economic society. People became so enamored with the idea of faking meat and of manipulating meat to emphasize the meaty qualities but make it better that we actually see the very first instance of people making a vegetarian meat turkey at a Thanksgiving celebration in Chicago this is in 1912, if I remember correctly, where they literally took a nut-based meat substitute and molded it to look like a turkey, drumsticks and all. The women that were listed here were also very prominent members of Chicago's philanthropic class. All right, so let's compare the early conversion narratives that we talked about before that tied together physical, moral, and political uplift with the ones that popped up at the end of the 19th century, a time where vegetarianism began embracing a new ethos that was reflected by consumerism, the idea of eating vegetarian food for the improvement of the self. We see here in these two quotes the emphasis on the idea of the accumulation of wealth for comfort. Contrast this to early vegetarians who attacked economic inequality. In fact, actually argued one of the reasons that people need to turn to a vegetarian diet was to try to ensure that there was more economic equity in the United States. That second quote from the Aesthetics of Vegetarianism focuses on the idea of vegetarianism as being a becoming diet, right? Attaching social status connected to vegetarianism in order to both promote the diet, but then also promote the individual rather than, say, society at large. A good example of this concept is seen here in the writings of one Carica Lafarve. She was a Chicago socialite, and in a really gendered domestic manual called Mother's Help and Child's Best Friend, Lafarve explained that women should embrace meatless diets because of their maternal roles. Vegetarianism was needed because it was in the interest of the nation, she explained, to produce sweet-tempered and orderly mothers who could help raise sweet-tempered and orderly children. I'll remind here that vegetarianism in a previous generation was actually promoted as a way to liberate women from the kitchens in the early 19th century. The press caught on to the rising popularity of meat substitutes and extolled their virtues as cheap, nutritious alternatives. The Chicago Tribune, for example, proclaimed mock meats in June of 1902 to have helped solve the meat problem, specifically its high price and its increasing scarcity. The article extolled J.H. Kellogg as the hardest and most persistent worker that the author had ever met, a living example of the superiority of a vegetarian over a meat diet. With the cost of meat so high as to make it an expensive luxury even to the well-to-do classes, the writer had come to prefer meat substitutes to actual flesh. He explained that these temptingly prepared foods were created by scientific investigations of the sand that utilized rationalization to perfect nature's vegetable foods. Vegetarianism was becoming a moneymaker, and this was reflected in the growth of vegetarian businesses throughout the United States, including vegetarian restaurants in major cities. The first chain of vegetarian restaurants, the Physical Culture Restaurant, opened during this time period, which explicitly tied vegetarianism to physical health, strength, vitality, and bodybuilding. At its height, the restaurant chain included 8 restaurants in New York City alone, and by 1908, 30 locations operated simultaneously in the United States, reaching to Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Buffalo. These restaurants, you can see this one in the background in Lower Manhattan, became really popular again during the Great Depression because they were so cheap. The Physical Culture restaurants had a penny dining on the top floor and then finer dining on the bottom floor, which was just 5 cents, which is part of the reason why vegetarianism was embraced out of necessity by some people once the Depression hit. Proteose, however, did have a shelf life. After J.H. Kellogg's death, the Battle Creek Sanitarium Food Company was bought by Worthington Foods, an Adventist run food company based in California. Worthington Foods continued selling Proteose all the way until 2000. And at that point, it was purchased by a food megalith. Any ironic guesses? Why, yes, it was the Kellogg's Food Company that bought out Proteose in 2000 and immediately ended its lifetime because they did not want it to compete with their Morningstar Farms lines of vegetarian meats. The shift for the vegetarian movement at this time period found its mouthpiece with the establishment of a new vegetarian organization, the VSA, Vegetarian Society of America, in 1886. That organization was the longest existing national vegetarian association in the United States for a very long time, actually until very recently. And it remained in operation until 1921, which is the end year of my book. There's another Maine connection here, as VSA president and founder Henry S. Clubb worked in Maine for a while as an advocate for temperance and helped pass the Maine temperance law in 1850. Not surprisingly, given the new vegetarianism's embrace by mainstream society, the VSA perpetuated the same qualities emphasized in Battle Creek, especially in its magazine, the very appropriately named Vegetarian Magazine. The magazine reported on athletic accomplishments of vegetarians, including the University of Chicago's football team that trained on an all-vegetarian diet in 1907. vegetarian muscle men and weightlifters, new vegetarian products, and instructions on how vegetarianism could best prepare an individual to accumulate wealth. Conversely, from 1888 until 1910, the Vegetarian magazine did not include a single article on the economic benefits of vegetarianism for the impoverished. Neither did the magazine speak out against poverty or economic injustice, which were two favorite issues of the first generation of the movement. And lastly, during the height of the women's suffrage movement and the rise of Jim Crow and the establishment of Jim Crow, the issues remained almost entirely ignored by vegetarianism's flagship periodical. So what does it all mean? The demographics and values of the new vegetarianism clearly paid dividends for the movement's popularity and public image, as the popular press praised the diet and its adherents. Vegetarians understood that in order to grow their movement and gain favor from wider audiences, they needed to embrace notions of physical strength and promote the diet as a vehicle for social and economic advancement of the self. While this shift made vegetarianism more popular and commercially successful, it also ensured that it became fractured from its previous attachments to social reform. And maybe it gives us some pause to reflect on the ways in which ethical diets can often be promoted today. We can maybe take from this there's a need to be aware and sensitive of the ways that promotion of ethical diets can reflect the aims of a movement at any given time. There are implications to how movements present themselves, and even how individuals explain their own conversions. We often see that vegetarianism and veganism are marketed through similar notions of hypermasculinity that happened at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, as well as conventional notions of health and beauty standards. Now, by all means, meatless diets can and should be associated with personal health, but I do wonder what it means to focus on this part of the diet at the expense of others. Similar notions to what we just looked at in those previous slides were abundant in the late 19th and early 20th century and promoted notions of health and social success while also disconnecting vegetarianism from its politicized past, and even allowed it to become attached to the most toxic ideologies at the time. Still, I don't want to end on this note because it would negate the true importance of vegetarianism in the 19th century and where it fits within reform movements of the time. Vegetarians were the first group en masse in the United States to focus on the social implications of food choice and how what we eat can have political and social power. Abolitionists, for example, during a little bit of a later time period, ran with this example. They boycotted sugar and cotton in order to not help fund the oppression based in the plantation South. Vegetarians kind of modeled this behavior, at least in an idealized way, before abolitionists took on the mantle. Vegetarians have made up anywhere between 4 to 6% of the US population, according to various Gallup polls over time. The earliest Gallup poll on the topic was in 1943 and measured out 2%. And as such, the movement has been tied to social reform in the United States for well over 200 years now. And while vegetarians may still struggle with how to best explain and promote the diet, perhaps looking to the past is one way to think about the transformative power of food, food choice, and food identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. That was terrific.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Folks, don't forget that you can type any questions you might have for Adam in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll start us off with the first question. So, can you tell me a little bit about how you became interested in this topic?
That's a really great question. Research often is so personal, right? Even if it's not something that you're directly connected to, it comes from personal, a place within you. When I first came across this topic, it was literally a one-line mention in a book about dialogues about sex in early 19th century America. And there was just a really brief mention about vegetarians through the lens of Grahamites. And I had just recently converted, I'll use the converted phrase here, converted to a vegetarian diet at the time. And very quickly I realized, one, I was like, wow, this thing existed. Oh, right, of course it existed. But it struck me that I didn't know, right? That I had made this really significant personal change, yet I hadn't investigated the past of this movement when I made this change. Whereas if I had made, say, like a political a political conversion or religious conversion, I probably would have spent some time looking at its past. And here I am, somebody studying history, and I hadn't done that when I made this change in diet. So to me, it's really remarkable and really wild to see like the exhibit up at the Historical Society, and all the work that's been done to kind of suss out what that looked like in Maine. Because this story was so invisible for a long time, and then just to be able to find this one line in a book, and just all of a sudden a universe explodes. And to me, that's the best thing about being a historian, is just being able to create universes out of little crumbs.
Mhm.
And so just one line is what sparked my interest in the topic.
Wow. Someone in the audience is asking, do you know where did the idea you should the prescription drink 8 glasses of water a day? Do you know that where that originated?
I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for that. I'm not sure, but I will say this. One thing that you see in the new vegetarianism of the turn of the 20th century, um, is that because the diet becomes sort of detached from social reform, from what I would say is radical social reform, that they're kind of experimenting with a lot of different things. So you have people who are experimenting with starvation diets, and you see people who are Bernard McFadden, who I had an image up before, experimented with eating just grapes during the day and starving for intermittent fasting, what we call intermittent fasting today, and things like that. And one of the things that people did sort of flirt with is the idea of like upping their water consumption.
Mm.
But one thing that we do see in the early vegetarians is that they are promoting pure, clean water as a much better alternative than not just alcohol, but also stimulants like coffee and tea.
Mm.
I'll take
Someone
a
is
sip of tea in response to that.
someone is asking, how did the Protos recipe taste? Would you call it more peanutty than meaty?
The best description I can have for it is that it is chicken adjacent, as much as I can remember what the taste of chicken is like. It's definitely peanutty. Um, one time I made it and I cheated and I put brewer's yeast in it, and that helped the flavor. Um, um, I think that it's definitely peanutty. What I will say is that you can really feel and taste how it was a significant step up for vegetarian food. And certainly how it predicts where vegetarian food will go over the 20th century. I mean, during the early 19th century, when vegetarianism is seen as really threatening and there are fewer people practicing it, the meals are very probably bland and very kind of basic. There's not a ton of evidence about what those look like, but what's there, it's a lot of boiled vegetables, things like that. So I think that it's hard to put yourself into the position of tasting food like somebody would have, say, in
Sure.
1903.
Mhm.
But you can get the sense of like how this was a fairly significant change and a fairly significant step up.
Another question from the audience. Is it fair to say that vegetarianism was growing nicely in the early 1900s, but slowed down from 1930 to 1960? And if so, why? Why did that happen?
Yeah, there's somebody out there needs to take on the mantle and write that second book of what happens to vegetarianism in those kind of
Mm.
intervening years. There is, I mean, in the 1940s, there's somebody runs for president on the American Vegetarian Party line. I think it's 1948. So here's my idea, and I don't know how fleshed out it is. My sense is that by the 1920s, because of vegetarianism's success as a movement, its very success as a movement means that it does not need to exist as a movement anymore, right? So
Mm-hmm.
people can be part of a community, part of an ideal, part of an association with other people with a shared diet. Um, and they don't necessarily need a national organization in the same way that they did in the 19th century and then also in the early years of the 20th
It's
century.
kind of more accepted and part of like the everyday fabric.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think what I like to say is that by that point, it's probably just as recognized and understood as it is today.
Mm.
Um, and it's interesting because in a way, like a good parallel is that by the 19 I think I'm gonna butcher the dates here because I forget exactly when it is, but the 1940s is when you see the American Vegan Society form. And so they're kind of sussing out a new identity and a new community that comes out of that. And they really do need a national organization in order to do that, to be able to define what this thing is, what are the shared goals, what are the shared ideals of this movement.
Mhm. Another question. Have there been any studies on the longevity of vegetarians in the 19th century? Were they
Oh, God.
living, longer than their contemporary than
I wish that there were, because that would be really fascinating social history material. One of the things that I will say that vegetarians ran into is that what happens when you have people who are promoting this diet and then they die early, and that actually happens to Graham relatively early. And one of the kind of ironic things is, how is it covered in the vegetarian press? They kind of throw him under the bus. And they say, like, don't worry, it's not that he was a vegetarian, that he was sickly and he died. Why did he die? Because when he was sick, he ate a little bit of meat to try to warm up his blood. And that may be true. It's possible that he did, but it is interesting that they're emphasizing this part uh,
Mm,
of his demise. But it was a way to kind of still promote the diet while taking its most prominent advocate and kind of throwing him to the wolves at that point.
yeah. Another good question. Did changes in food technology like canning, flash freezing, did that have an effect on vegetarianism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the new vegetarianism of the 20th century, I mean, it's all being shipped across the United States in cans, and so it's making it more cheap, it's making it more abundant, more available. One of the really interesting things that happens, I can't remember the exact year offhand, but somewhere in the early 20th century, maybe early 19 teens, there's a debate about what kind of classification vegetable meats should have under the USDA. Vegetarian advocates said that it should be considered vegetables and it would have been cheaper to ship. And advocates of meat said, well, no, no, you're saying it's meat, so it should be meat, as a way to try to undercut them from a competition
Mm,
standpoint. I find that really interesting and fascinating, because we've seen similar things pop up in recent years, where there have been challenges, not just in the United States, but in other places, of, can you classify meat substitutes as meats? Can you substitute non-dairy milks as milk, and so on and so forth? And
right,
obviously,
right.
there's always a reason why people are making these challenges,
Sure.
and trying to understand why is probably the more important part about whether or not they're meat or whether or not they're milk.
You mentioned, you talk a lot in the lecture about connections to Christianity, to religion, to religious leaders. Do you know of any connection to the spiritualist movement and vegetarianism?
Yeah, I never saw strong connections between vegetarianism and spiritualism. My guess is that there were, because I mean, they were very concentric circles, right?
Mm.
That people would have been involved in. But I did not explore that very deeply. So I would really not be surprised if there were, but I didn't see sort of deep connections there.
Sure. One last question and we'll wrap it up. And folks have really enjoyed your lecture, Adam, so thank you so much. Um, did vegetarianism become popular in Western culture through America alone, or do other Western countries, or I would say even like beyond the West, do other countries and cultures have an influence on this?
Yeah, so there's a transatlantic exchange going on for early vegetarianism. So the word vegetarian starts to be used first in England. So there's a vegetarian society that forms in England 2 years before the United States. They're in correspondence with each other. I think that's the way that the word vegetarian makes its way into the vernacular of the American vegetarians when they decide upon it. At the end of and there are interesting parallels, but then also digressions between these two movements. So in England, um, vegetarianism remains what I know about it remains fairly radical at the end of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century. It's tied to the suffragette movement. It's it's tied to the animal rights, the burgeoning animal rights movement. It's interesting in the United States, even though animal welfare pops up in the post-Civil War years, that it doesn't connect itself really to vegetarianism or even before. Vegetarians, the early vegetarians kind of were so focused on the on what meat meant for the individual that they didn't really care about non-human animals. And in fact, said, "Why are we not eating this? Because we don't want to become animalistic like them." Um, so that's an interesting sort of disconnection that in England the burgeoning animal rights and animal welfare movement is tied to vegetarianism, where in the United States we see it kind of stay disconnected. Early 20th century and beyond. I mean, the 1893, the Chicago World's Fair. There's a vegetarian Congress essentially at the World's Fair, and you see all the other places that's starting to pop up. I know that there's a fairly significant one in Germany during the time period as well. And there are very similar values in all these places that are tying it to physical culture, athletics, and so forth.
Well, thank you again. This was really great. Now we're getting some great feedback in the chat. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. Anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
I just want to thank everybody so much again for being here and for taking some time tonight. I really appreciate the questions also. Let's see if I'm facing the right way. I'll plug my book, which is over my shoulder here. So The Vegetarian Crusade, which was put out by University of North Carolina Press. If you and My contact information is online. You can find me pretty easily via email if you'd like to, and on Blue Sky as well. So if you'd like to reach out with anything else, I'd be so happy to be in touch.
Thanks very much. And thanks, folks, again for being here. Hope we see everyone back here real soon.